what if I told you the length of your fingers, like how long they are,
Yeah.
could be linked to your sexual orientation?
Mm.
Sounds pretty wild, right?
Yeah, it does kind of sound like something you'd hear from a fortune teller.
Right.
But there's actual scientific research on this, believe it or not.
Oh, wow.
We're going to be unpacking a 2002 study today.
Okay.
It's from the journal Archives of Sexual Behavior.
Mm.
And it's called Differences in Finger Length Ratios Between Self-Identified Butch and Femme Lesbians.
Okay, so before we get into lesbian finger lengths,
Yeah.
let's talk about this 2D.4D ratio I keep
Mhm.
hearing about.
Okay.
What is that?
So the 2D.4D ratio, it's pretty simple, really.
Okay.
It's just the length of your index finger, which is referred to as 2D, divided by the length of your ring finger, which is 4D.
Okay.
Now, researchers, they think that this ratio is influenced by how much androgen exposure you had in the womb back when you were a fetus.
Okay.
And usually men, they have a lower 2D.4D ratio,
Oh, okay.
which could mean they had higher androgen exposure when they were developing.
So lower ratio, more androgens, and that, how does that tie back to sexual orientation?
Well, that's a theory that some researchers are exploring right now.
Okay.
So this particular study that we're talking about today,
Yeah.
they looked at over 260 women,
Wow.
and that included heterosexual women, bisexual women, and homosexual women.
Okay.
And to gather the data, they measured finger lengths from photocopies.
That's actually really clever,
Yeah.
using photocopies.
And then they had the participants self-identify their sexual orientation
Got it.
and also whether they consider themselves butch or femme.
Okay, so was there actually a difference in finger length ratios between those different groups?
So, yeah,
Okay.
what they found was that on average, the self-identified butch lesbians,
Okay.
they had a significantly lower 2D.4D ratio,
Yeah.
specifically on their right hand.
Oh, interesting. Just the right hand.
Yeah, when compared to the femme lesbians.
Okay.
And this difference, it was mainly because on average, the butch lesbians had a longer ring finger.
Okay, so hold on. Butch lesbians had a longer ring finger.
Yeah.
So that would mean a lower 2D.4D ratio,
Exactly.
which could suggest higher androgen exposure in the womb.
That's right.
Is this, are scientists saying that there's a direct link between what your finger length is and being a lesbian?
I wouldn't say it's quite that straightforward.
Okay.
Yeah, this study, it did find a correlation, but correlation, it doesn't necessarily equal causation.
I've heard that before. Correlation, causation.
Right, think of it this way. Just because people tend to wear raincoats when it's raining,
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that wearing a raincoat is what causes the rain, right?
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. That's a good example.
Yeah.
So just because you have a lower 2D.4D ratio,
Right.
it doesn't automatically make you a lesbian.
Exactly.
But if there is this connection to androgen exposure,
Mm-hmm.
why is that so important to researchers who are looking into sexual orientation?
Well, there's this theory called the androgen theory, and it suggests that if you have higher androgen exposure before you're born, so prenatally,
Okay.
that might actually play a role in how your sexual orientation develops, especially for women.
Got it.
So this potential link that they found in the study between 2D.4D ratios and sexual orientation in women, it kind of gives a little bit of support for that theory.
Yeah.
But it is really important to keep in mind that this is just one study, and there's a lot of other factors that could also be involved in figuring out, shaping a person's sexual orientation.
Right. So obviously genetics and also your social environment and also just your own personal experiences.
All of that.
All of that could be a part of this whole thing.
Yeah, definitely.
So we're not saying that finger length determines anything,
Right.
but more that it could be a small, tiny piece of a much larger puzzle.
Exactly. Yeah.
Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And
Okay.
also, it's important to remember that this study has some limitations, particularly because it relies on people, self-identifying as butch or femme.
Okay, yeah.
And those are complex identities, and they can mean different things to different people,
Right.
even within the lesbian community.
That's true. There's no universal checklist for butch or femme.
Exactly.
But this whole idea that something so tiny,
Yeah.
like finger length,
I know.
could be connected to your sexual orientation, that's pretty mind-blowing.
It is pretty wild.
It really just shows how complex human development is,
Yeah, definitely.
Don't you think?
For sure. It really makes you realize we just don't have all the answers yet.
Yeah.
Even within, groups of butch lesbians or femme lesbians,
Right.
there's going to be a whole range of 2D.4D ratios.
Totally. So we're not trying to use this to put people in boxes based on their finger length?
No, definitely not. This is about averages.
Okay.
This research, it raises more questions than it answers, really.
I can see that.
It makes us think about how these findings connect with other things that might be involved.
Like what kind of things?
Like how do genetics and social environment, all that stuff, like how does that play into all of this?
Yeah, like nature versus nurture.
Exactly. Are we born this way, or do we become this way because of what we experience?
Yeah, that's a question for the ages.
I know, right?
But okay, go back to this study.
Yeah.
Is there anything else about like how they did the research or like what they found that we should be careful about?
Well, one thing to remember is that this study was done back in 2002.
Oh,
and research methods have, obviously come a long way since then.
right.
And our understanding of sexual orientation has evolved too.
So we should look at what they found as like a starting point,
Exactly.
not the end of the story.
More like a breadcrumb trail leading us deeper into the woods.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah.
And speaking of breadcrumbs, this whole 2D.4D thing, is this only something that researchers who study sexual orientation are looking at?
No, actually, researchers are exploring 2D.4D ratios all over the place. Yeah, they're looking at it for personality traits, athletic ability, even financial risk-taking.
Wow. So they're looking at our fingers for all kinds of stuff.
There's a whole world of something called digital anthropology.
Digital anthropology. What is that?
Yeah, it's super interesting.
So basically, like, our hands could tell us more than we think.
Yeah, it's kind of a fascinating thought, isn't it?
It really is.
Our bodies might have all these little clues about who we are and how we act.
It makes you wonder what else we haven't figured out yet.
Totally.
So for our listeners who are like, whoa, this is crazy, I want to learn more, what would you say are the, like, big takeaways from our deep dive today on lesbian finger length ratios?
I think the biggest thing is to remember to not oversimplify what we found.
Okay.
This research, it does show us a possible link.
Right.
But it doesn't mean we can just look at someone's fingers and know their sexual orientation.
Right. Correlation, not causation. We got to remember that.
Exactly.
Okay, what else?
I think it's also really important to recognize that it's not always accurate to rely on labels.
Yeah.
Especially with identities that are complex and fluid, like butch and femme.
Right. Those labels don't always tell the whole story.
They don't, so it's a good reminder to be mindful of how we use labels.
For sure. Anything else?
Yeah, I just say, when we look at this kind of research, or any scientific research really, it's good to come at it with both curiosity and critical thinking.
So not just take it at face value.
Yeah, dig a little deeper, ask some questions, be open to other ways of looking at it.
That's a good point. Science is always changing.
Exactly. What we think we know today might be different tomorrow, and that's okay.
That's part of the fun.
It is. It's all part of the process.
I've learned a lot from this deep dive today.
Me too.
I'm sure our listeners are feeling the same way. This idea that something so subtle as finger length ratios could be tied to something so personal as your sexual orientation.
It really is something.
It makes you think about what other hidden connections might be out there.
It's a fascinating question.
Don't you think?
It really is. It makes you look at yourself and the world in a whole new way.
Yeah, it really does make you wonder what other, like, seemingly unimportant traits might actually be super important.
It's like we're all walking around with these, like, treasure maps, but they're, like, on our bodies.
Right.
And we're just starting to, like, figure out how to read them.
So, like, where do we go from here? If someone's listening and they're like, whoa, I got to know more.
Yeah.
What would you suggest they do?
I definitely say check out the original study by Williams et al.
Okay.
It's available online for free. You can just look it up.
Awesome. We'll put a link in the show notes, too.
Yeah, and if you want to get, like, a broader view of the whole 2D.4D thing, there are some really good review articles out there. They look at how it might connect to all sorts of stuff.
Cool. So, like, personality and behavior and all that.
Yeah.
Awesome. We'll link to those, too. Any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the most important thing to remember is to, like, approach this kind of research with an open mind, but also a critical eye.
So be open to it, but don't just blindly accept it.
Exactly. It's fascinating, it makes you think, and it definitely pushes us to question things. But it's not about, like, coming to a final answer or labeling people.
It's more about just getting curious and exploring.
Right.
Yeah, and realizing how complex human nature really is.
Well said.
Thanks.
This deep dive has given me so much to think about.
Yeah, me too.
And I'm sure our listeners feel the same way.
Oh,
Huge thank you to our expert for joining us today.
It was my pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Unlock Your Mind podcast.
Yeah, do it.
We'll see you next time for another mind-blowing deep dive.
See ya.